Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome once again to the commissioners, and once again I say thanks to each and every one of you on behalf of the mayor and everyone else at City Hall. I don't know about you, but I'm beginning to feel as if I work for them, but with no salary. It's harder to see the end, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. You know, before we get started with our business today, I wanted us to stop and to remember Amber Evans. I did not know Amber. I had never met her. I was grateful to read what I read, in the paper about her life, and certainly a loss not only to her family and her projects, but to our community at large. And rather than asking for a minute of silence, I have asked Pastor Ridley if he would just say a prayer for us today.
Let's just bow our heads. Father, in this moment, we just pause and are reminded of your scriptures that says that we can cast all of our cares upon you because you care for us. And we're thankful to know that in this moment of tragedy that you're a God who cares. And right now, Father, I'm asking that you would just comfort the family, Amber's mom, Tanya, all of her siblings, her father, comfort them during this time of sadness and bereavement. I pray, God, that you would just touch all of the youth that she impacted, the Juvenile Justice Coalition, all of the young people, the children, that lives that she helped to change for the better. Pray that you would comfort them during this time. I pray even that you would just touch everyone in this room, Lord God, all of those who have been impacted by Amber's life. And we thank you for the 28 years that you gave her to us. Though they were short years, they were very productive years. And even now, God, we remember her on this day. And we're praying that the impact that she made in this city would just continue to last for a lifetime. This is my prayer. In Christ's name, amen.
Thank you, Pastor. And I would add to that, because we're seeing this across the country, the two young people who took their lives out of Parkland, the father of one of the youngsters from Sandy Hook. But even those that we don't see and aren't lifted up in the paper, suicide amongst our young people and others, I think, is still growing. So each and every one of us has an opportunity, if we have young people in our lives, just to say to them, we're here for you. If you got something you want to talk about, just let's do that, because we are truly living in some very challenging and disturbing times. And I'm sure it's just even more difficult for our young people. So with that, the next item.
On that note, can I make a comment?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I was just, thinking on the way over here, are we doing enough about officer wellness and those kind of things here in the Columbus Division of Police? And if so, could we get some sort of a, presentation on what that looks like? And if it's not enough, are there some things we should be doing that we're not doing?
I think that we did. I don't know how much detail, but I'll follow up with you, because just in the last week, and someone can help me out, it was another city, but they have lost between 5 and 6 officers to suicide
Yes, right.
within the last year. So your point is absolutely right on target. Did we have such a presentation, or was it just very minimum?
Yes, Chair.
It was on the
We did.
EAP program. They played.
Yes.
So
Peer assistance team and the Irish Velasco came in and talked about all the different programs. Rhonda Grizel, Commander Grizel, and our pastors.
And is
Yeah, I
that
guess
sitting
I'm
in a
just kinda
particular
thinking
committee?
In light of what's new, is it profound, or is it just what we're doing? Are we pushing the envelope? Are we really looking for, provocative ways of, looking at issues related to wellness, or are we just kind of following the traditional EAP and organizational strategies?
Actually, no, sir. I have a 5-pronged plan that I presented to the mayor on what I was wanting to innovate after I get some also recommendations from both Matrix and the commission.
Okay.
But one full prong of that is on officer wellness programs basically a morale, wellness, and recreation section that is going to encompass all of our programs, and a lot of them are going to be new and more innovative.
I can't help, Brian, you were shaking your head, Brian. I don't-
Yeah, I would just add that in addition to the review by Matrix that is specific to CPD, we're also doing a technology phase with a different firm, and there are a lot of sort of cutting-edge technology products that are out there that would vastly improve officer wellness and frankly help us in a lot of areas in our city. So I would expect to see a robust response from Matrix to support the chief and his initiatives, and then additional information from PFM on technological solutions.
Thank you.
Thank you for caring
Was there
about
was
that.
another?
Thank you.
If a hand is coming from, oh, was there one
I
here?
was just going to say, yeah, it's Chicago, and
Chicago.
it's 5 since July. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
Chief, will we be able to see your full list of recommendations once the matrix report is done and our recommendations are made? Will we be able to see that in coordination with your recommendations?
Yes, sir. I'm providing Director Speaks with a list of areas where I'm working on, and I asked to meet with Chair Jackson to go lay out what it is I'm working on, so I don't either duplicate or go down a different path than what you may be looking to move, so we don't have to undo something, a month or two later. So we're trying to, deconflict those, and I will be happy to, once I put that plan in place, provide it to the commission. We're meeting on April 17th and 18th as executive staff to be able to finalize all of those plans and announce them publicly.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions? We next have on the agenda the approval of the minutes from January the 23rd. They came before you at the last meeting. Once again, I said to Ellen, thank you, thank you, thank you. She went back. She looked at the video tape again, didn't see anything, any major changes, and then March 14th. So I'd like an approval of those two sets of minutes, and then I'm going to make a comment. Is there a motion for both approval of January 23rd and March 14th?
So moved.
So moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Second. Any other questions? All in favor of approving those minutes, raise your hand. Any opposition? And I will maybe say this at another meeting, since all of our commissioners are not here. Minutes are not meant to be transcriptions of any public meeting like that. If so, we would have a paid transcriber sitting here the way we do courts. They are a summary of what has taken place. I personally, I've said it before and I'll say it again, the fact that Ellen, who is a commissioner, who serves on a committee, and then takes the time to go back through that recorded and to come up with minutes like this is almost superhuman. So again, I want to say thank you. But we're not going to ask her to do that.
Please, 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 please.
Because, again, if there are any questions about anything, the recordings of the meetings will be at least a part of the official record, and I don't know how long they'll be kept. But anyone can go back and take a look themselves. But I'm just not going to burden her with doing that again. That is something that is very specific, but whatever. I'm not going to do that. We're now going to move on to the subcommittee reports. Andrea, you're up first.
Yeah, we think we have completed the heavy lifting that addresses the topic, the hiring subcommittee work. And we are at a point where we welcome the input of the public to further continue our inquiry. And then we also look forward to the information that Matrix will provide us to then further develop our recommendations to present to the rest of the commission.
And later in the meeting, before the other chairs maybe share the same thoughts, when we get to the looking ahead, the commission timeline, I'll be able to give you some very specific, I hope, dates of when certain things will happen, okay?
Thank you.
Training subcommittee?
So our last meeting was actually prior to our last full commission meeting, and we are meeting with members of Hot Topics and 21st Century Policing immediately after this meeting today, so that we can see where we might have some overlap to avoid kind of duplicative things.
Thank you. 21st century. Dr. Jones is not here.
Yeah, so in Dr. Jones's absence, we are, like Commissioner Burns already said, going to be meeting with them to discuss the overlap, but currently we're just on course to continue with the work that's already been done that we laid out earlier.
Okay, thank you. And finally, hot topics.
So we also did not have any meetings since the last meeting, but we'll be also part of that joint conversation. And I have circulated some more information for our committee on a topic that Tamer's interested in, which is community legitimacy and some recommendations and programs from other cities that I think are interesting. I also had some conversations with Commander Meter to compare kind of our training on those areas to what those cities do.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from any of the commissioners on any of the reports?
Chair, if you don't mind, just a quick reminder that if more than 8 commissioners take part in the meeting afterwards, it is considered a public meeting with all the notice and records that are required. So we'll just encourage you to make sure there are 8 or fewer in that.
8 or fewer. Thank you. I will not tell you the contents, but I will share that one of my taskmasters, Mr. Sims, sent me an email very late last night, and I did the right thing by not opening it. I saw it. So when I got up and opened it this morning, the contents were quite different than what I had discussed with Elon and Brian just a week or so ago. And I had a 2-word response that I don't feel that I will share, but I thought about it. I actually had hit reply and had written, the words, and then I said, public record. Probably not a good thing. And it was really just around the fact that I felt that I would be working for them forever and a day. So, but I do think about that public record before I do certain things. Well, if you don't have any other comments.
Chair?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Question? I know at our last meeting, there had been a request by another commissioner to have a placeholder on the agenda for an update on current events, and I didn't see that on this agenda, so I didn't know if we were moving forward with that.
I actually didn't plan on doing that. This is my recall. We've had updates in the past, specifically from the city attorney's office. We've not had anyone from the command coming in and doing updates on, for example, investigations. Because I think what was specifically mentioned was maybe the investigation around the Vice Squad, right? And I would just like to remind us of where we're supposed to be. We're not an investigatory body, and I don't know if we should be seeing or hearing anything more than what we can do in the newspaper if there's a specific topic. But it's not my recall or either the teams that they came in.
We did once from Deputy Chief Becker. We had an updated report. I think we were at Franklin University.
Was there something in particular?
I think it
Because
was
out of all of
perhaps
our
surrounding
meetings, they've
Donna
not come in
Dalton.
every meeting and said, here's an update from the police department.
Yeah, I think maybe we had that one update, and so I think maybe that's what sparked the question, are we going to have other updates of that nature?
It's not a part of our work.
Okay.
From my perspective. Certainly, there's been a lot, in the newspaper, but there are other, for example, with Vice, that's an investigation by the FBI. I wouldn't want them to get into anything that they shouldn't be saying if there's, in fact, an ongoing, investigation. And there's so much, almost on a daily basis, about what's happening, whether it's homicide or this or that. I felt it was a little broad and not really clear enough. I mean, if there's something in particular that a commissioner has an interest in, send me a note, and I will see what I can do.
Okay.
Okay?
And then one more question. I didn't know if it was possible to receive, it doesn't necessarily have to be like the perfect agenda, but the topic that's going to be discussed a little bit more ahead of time rather than just 24 hours in case we wanted to do some of our own research. I know for myself, 24 hours just isn't quite enough time. So just a request.
We will try to do that. I do know that with all that's going on, I'll just say at City Hall, sometimes this doesn't happen to kind of the last minute. It did earlier when we get really laid out. If you remember, I think maybe it was the first or second meeting, we had the topics. We now find ourselves in a position of, I won't say that they're last minute decisions, but really kind of figuring what needs to go forward. I will tell you that this meeting today is not specifically what we discussed on March 20th. So again, there are things that are in flux. But your point is an excellent one, and we will do our very best to do that. I agree with you, okay? We are now going to have a presentation of use of force national trends and best practices with John Scruggs from Matrix Consulting. Welcome, John.
Thank you. We'll give everybody mic. Ooh. Further over. So thanks for having me here today. This presentation I'm going to give is kind of a broad overview of the national trends we've seen. There's a little bit of research in here, and at the end of it, I also put in some of the documents. I sent copies of them to Elon as well, some of the documents that are out there. A little history on me. I worked in law enforcement for 26 years. I retired as a captain. I did stints in a number of different assignments, including training in vice and street crimes. And most of my time was actually in patrol. I also spent time writing policies and working in the chief's office. I still maintain active membership in a lot of police association type committees and regularly attend International Association of Chiefs Police Conference. And also do a lot of peer research. The last 3 years I've been working as a consultant, so I spend a lot of time working with training divisions actually all around the country. So I do a lot of interviews with folks talking about what they're training, what their curriculum is at. I actually analyze that for some agencies. They ask us to look at what they're training and if that's current. So with that, I'm going to stand back a little bit here. So use of force, this is just a free picture off the internet, just so you know. It's foreign, and I always like to do that just because I don't want to put anyone in the spotlight, but when we're talking about use of force, a lot of times we have bad connotations to that. And so when I'm going to talk about use of force today, I'm just really going to talk about some of the trends in training and how we're looking at use of force nationally. And this comes from a lot of larger departments, but even some of the smaller departments. So there's no one definition that's accepted universally of what use of force is. And the National Institute of Justice has asked many different folks. They've looked at a bunch of different policies. And then you have the one from IACP, which is basically using force to compel someone to an action that they don't want to do, whether that is moving someone back at a crime scene to taking someone in custody or up into including deadly physical force. So when we talk about use of force, I think I'll move this real quick here. We're talking about not just the force that's used, but the training, the tactics, the policy, documenting and monitoring, supervision, investigation, and I mean as far as administrative investigation up to including deadly force investigation. And I watched the playback of your last meeting where you were talking about some boards. So I did put a little bit in here about civilian review boards, some of the things that are occurring currently around the country. So it all really starts with training, and training has developed over the last 30 years to what we're doing today and what best practices are. And really, the biggest issue is that we're seeing a lot more of training scenario-based type. 20, 30 years ago, it was very mechanical. It was you go to the range, you're going to fire X hundred rounds, you're going to get your baton or whatever the instrument is, and you're going to spend a lot of hours doing that. We talked about scenarios a lot of times, and a lot of times it would be seat time. We discuss a incident or watch a video. But what most law enforcement agencies are doing now is a lot more scenario-based. And as you can see in this, and this is from PERF, they did a survey in 2016 of hours spent in use of force training for departments around the country. And as you can see, scenario-based is at 24 hours. If you would have looked at that 20 years ago, it probably would have been 4 or 8. So that's where we're seeing a bigger trend is scenario-based. And I'll go into it a little bit more further down the slide presentation here. But a lot of that is about decision making, and you can't get decision making out of just learning how to use your baton or how to use pepper spray or how to use a taser. You have to have it in scenario based, and so we want to stress officers to make the right decisions. So basic recruit, the focus, like I said, used to be really just mechanical, and the trend that we see nationally is really looking about situational awareness, adapting to the situation, a big emphasis on de-escalation and on weighing options, including what is the governmental interest in the action I'm about to take? Meaning, do I even really need to do this? And the other part of it is winnable scenarios. 20 years ago, a lot of times it'd be an I gotcha moment when you'd go through a training scenario. So you'd send a recruit through, and it would be, and a great explaining would be, you go to domestic, they have you try to work through that scenario, and all of a sudden someone completely unrelated to the scenario pops out from underneath a cabinet and starts engaging you in a gunfight. Not even realistic, but it was kind of a gotcha moment. And that used to be fairly prevalent around the country maybe 20, 30 years ago. What we're seeing now is a lot more reality-based, good acting, scripted roles, things that are well laid out, and they're winnable, because you want to encourage officers to win the scenario. You want them to be successful. We're also seeing a big push to winnable could be conversation, and a lot of scenarios should not. And it used to be every scenario was some kind of force. You just had to figure out what the right one was. A lot of scenario-based training we're seeing around the country now is the scenario may seem like it could have some kind of weapon used in it, but if you're using the right skills that we're teaching you, you're de-escalating, you're taking the right approaches, force does not have to be used to be successful. And that every event is not going to turn into a use of force. And I'm sure some of the officers have been here longer. They give you a taser. You never held one before. You go in a scenario, and what are you thinking? I haven't been holding one before, so this is a taser event. And lo and behold, you'd end up tasering somebody. What we're seeing now nationally, the trend is they issue all the weapons you should have, and they give you a little brief summary. But if you're using the right skills that they're teaching you, keeping your distance, your positioning, talking to folks the right way, engaging and building rapport, you're able to win the situation without using force. And so that's really the big push. Not that every situation is winnable with de-escalation. That's not what we're trying to teach folks, but what we're really trying to teach them is that that's a possibility, but 90% of what we do or more, 98% more likely, is not any of those. Training debriefs, these are more realistic now than they used to be. And a lot of times what we're seeing nationally is folks are doing student-led debrief. Tell us what you saw. Tell us what you were thinking. Tell us what are options you considered in this scenario. So rather than having a training officer say, here's what you messed up, you did this wrong, you did that wrong, you did this wrong, and then send you out of the room, and you think, wow, I didn't do real well. What we're really trying to do, and what we're seeing nationally, is bringing the officers aside, whether it was a group exercise or it's a one officer exercise, is having them lead the discussion. And you reinforcing, yeah, that was a great decision. When you backed up behind the car, that was a really good decision. How'd you feel when that subject got that close to you? What were you thinking? Having them think through their scenarios so they're weighing options and they're thinking and self-critiquing, because we want, at the end of the day, training should be positive. De-escalation is the big push all around the country, and we're seeing it in more and more curriculums. I'll discuss a little more about what that is further down the presentation, but just keep in mind, de-escalation is distance equals time equals options. If you don't have to close the gap and there's no immediate need to do so, if you do those things and you work on de-escalation, force may not be needed in a situation. And in training hours, we used to do a lot of what we call seat time. And a lot of places, if you went to class for 40 hours, they gave you 40 hours time for training. What we're seeing more is you actually got to demonstrate the skill that we taught you, and you also sometimes may have to be scored on it. So it's not just sitting in a classroom having death by PowerPoint, which is what you're getting here, but literally you're going to learn this material and we're going to test you on it. So the seat time type of training is really coming to an end in a lot of places. And in basic academy, again, we're talking about firearms, offensive tactics, driving, de-escalation, and really showing us that you actually know those. There's a long quote from PERF, but I think it's worth putting out here because this is fairly recent. They noted that officer training on use of force should be more integrated and scenario-based, and it should be integrated earlier. Not that you just learn how to use your firearm for 58 hours, and then at the end of the academy, we're going to have a scenario where you may or may not use it, but literally getting folks doing the scenarios earlier on in their training. That's a perfect recommendation, and we're actually seeing that throughout the country as well. In-service training is different than basic training. This is your officers who've been on, they're tenured, they've been around for a while. What we see, and this hasn't changed much, but we are seeing is continually update on case law changes, search and seizure, all those things can change from year to year. Legal opinion on use of force can change and needs to be updated. Progressive departments are also looking at what lawsuits they have, what's their complaints, what's their number one complaint, and they're developing curriculum around those things. So that if you have, and most departments, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's true here, I have looked at your complaint data, but rudeness is usually the number one complaint around the country for officers, that kind of thing. So if you have a rash of those, you may then incorporate 2 hours of customer service or de-escalation. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry to interrupt. PERF. Did we cover PERF? Because we're not all law enforcement.
Okay, I'm sorry, my bad. PERF is the Police Executive Research Forum. And it is to be a member, you have to have a 4-year degree. It's based in Washington, D.C. They hold regular meetings. They were active actually in 21st Century Policing as well. If there's any other acronyms I'm using, let me know, because I'll
ask. I'll ask. If I don't know, I'll ask.
But no, I appreciate that, sorry. So what, back to the, and then we usually have mandated training. A lot of that comes from the state. So every 2 years, an officer has to get CPR recertified, first aid recertified. If it's with, if you're an agency that has tasers deployed, you're mandatory recert there. So some of that's mandatory, and then states also will sometimes legislate what needs to be trained. Some states have mandated de-escalation training. Some states have looked at, other things that they decide is important to that state, and they've mandated it. So that's usually part of your 40-hour in-service training. And we're also seeing a lot more scenario-based training even in the in-service training. And larger departments like the Columbus Division of Police probably use a lot more actual actors or officers that could be actors. Smaller agencies are using those virtual reality simulators where they can pull up any kind of scenario because they don't have the staff to do that. Scenarios should be...
Go ahead.
So are you seeing any trends around dealing with individuals who are licensed to have a firearm, and how the training in dealing with those individuals, is there a change, or are we still using the same techniques and strategies that we used before individuals were licensed to be armed? Are you seeing any trends around that type of training or a change in it?
I am not currently seeing those. I will say in the 90s, I did see a bunch of training that, and that was with the uprising of the Posse Comitatus, and folks who didn't believe in, police, what they thought the sheriff was the law enforcement agent of the county, and they're the only ones they listened to. And those folks a lot of times would be armed and also disobey all laws, make their own license plates, make their own driver's licenses. But that specific, I have not seen that as a trend nationally. Scenario-based training a lot of times is developed on lawsuits, improper techniques. So if your training division has, and they go through all your use of force, and I heard the presentation 2 weeks ago, they look at all that. And if there's a trend like a takedowns being improperly used, or somebody has, a couple times we've done the wrong thing, a lot of times the training division will go, we're seeing a trend here where people are getting injured, either our officers or the community that we serve. We need to retrain this. And so it's almost like your hot topic. And a lot of times agencies, every year, they'll go through, what do we need to, what's the trends, what do we need to train to? And tactics. So we can't talk about use of force without talking about tactics. Tactics, a lot of times, will lead up to the use of force, and sometimes they can determine whether force is going to be used or not. They're not always a predictor of that, but good tactics can reduce the chance of that. So tactics used at incident can impact the need to use force, and therefore tactics should be considered when looking at use of force incidents. A lot of times we look at just the incident itself without what did the officer do beforehand. And so a lot of agencies are really looking at the tactics and including that in the overall view. And so there's a term I heard a chief say probably 20 years ago, and it's still applicable today. There are some things that are lawful but awful. And I'll give you kind of an example. It's not a policy violation and it's not a law violation. And I'll try to walk this way. I can just talk you out of it. So an officer responds to a situation and a call where there is a person that is acting, acting out, disturbing, they're kicking cars, they're armed with, say, some kind of weapon. The officer pulls up, they see him destroying public property, so you have a crime. They also see that they're armed. So they have a lawful reason to be there. They do see a crime occur, and the officer, rather than maybe waiting, holding back, knowing the person's irrational, they close the gap. The person they've closed the gap with the person who's armed. Now it turns into a shooting. They really haven't violated a policy per se because the person's armed and maybe trying to kill them and they shoot them. They haven't violated necessarily any, like state law or federal laws or policy because there was a crime occurring, they're going to make an arrest. However, if you look at the tactics and you have that person who is acting out and you see them causing a disturbance and you see that they're armed, maybe you're looking at different options and tactics. Maybe you're calling more people in. Maybe you're keeping your distance. So even though the end result may be lawful, the outcome is awful. It's not what we wanted. We point out with officer positioning, but also governmental interests. And we see this around, there's been lawsuits on this around the country. I think one in California pops in my head, and that was a suicidal person where they forced entry into the house. What is the governmental interest in someone who has no access to any of our victims, is only threatened violence against themselves, and then we're forcing our way into a house? So there's really low governmental interest there. We should do something. It's a mental health crisis, but do we really, is now the time to force the issue? Or the person there, you get information that they're drunk every night at 6 o'clock, they get into disturbance with their neighbor at 8 o'clock, they go back into their house, the neighbor says, yeah, you threatened me with a knife, now he's back in his house. Maybe you try to make contact, nothing there. You still have probable cause, you have all these other things, but if you know this person goes to work every morning at 8 o'clock, and that's what the neighbor tells you, and every night at 6 o'clock he's drinking, and now it's 8 o'clock, so you know he's really been drinking, is now the time? Or could you do a different option? Could you come back in the morning? Could you find out where they work? They're probably sober at work, right? So thinking of these different options, these are tactics that can actually reduce the use of force. And then we talk about tactical decision-making. This is one of the things that we're really seeing a lot of, and that's pre-planning. Even if it's a small call, a small plan is what we're seeing a lot of agencies do around. So if 2 or 4 officers go to a call and there's something they're going to try to deal with, making a pre-plan, hey, I'm going to be the talker, I'm going to make contact, would you stand off to the right? Here's what we got, making a small little plan. Those go a long ways, rather than 4 people not knowing that the other 4 people are actually doing. Even if you work together often, if you don't have a plan, sometimes you may go the wrong direction. And then a post-incident debrief. This is big, and we're seeing this really pushed in a lot of different training areas and on the street, which is, regardless of the outcome of the incident, even if it seemed like it went well, the person was taken into custody, you can always learn from everything you do. So even a quick debrief of, hey, when you went up there, and usually these are sergeant-led and they don't take long, hey, when you went up there on the porch by yourself, I really didn't think that was the best position for you to be in. Maybe we should have loud-hailed, or maybe we should have brought a couple more folks in, or we should have brought a CIT officer in. And you do these debriefs very quickly. Because when you're learning constantly on the job and you do these debriefs at the actual incident right afterwards and take that couple minutes to debrief it, you may do better on the next one, even if everything came out okay. 20 years ago, everything came out okay, even your tactics were terrible, but you high-fived everybody because we came out of it, right? That's not today. Today is, even if the outcome is good and we made mistakes, we should talk about it and fix it. And that's what we're seeing nationally being pushed down to patrol sergeants. De-escalation, as I said, has been really pushed a lot. And then crisis intervention training, CIT. A lot of the calls for service we're seeing now in major cities, some folks are saying 60 to 70% of their calls have some kind of mental health component to it. And so we're really seeing a lot of crisis intervention training integrated even at the basic level, but even more folks are actually pairing up officers with, a mental health crisis worker who responds to mental health calls. And then this is something that was unheard of 30 years ago, which is called walk away. Again, the drunk suicidal person that's in the house, you try to make contact, you can't get contact, you may flag that address for, what's going on, you may make a call to a mental health provider, you may do something else, but you don't set up a SWAT operation because somebody's threatening to kill themselves, because in the end, are you really going to force entry in a house on that? That might have happened 20, 30 years ago, but what we're seeing now nationally is we might just have to walk away from this one. We might have to call social services, see if there's somebody available to come out tonight, or see if they can put it on their list tomorrow, or see if there's a better time or location we can talk to this person rather than force the issue now. So policy drives use of force. It's hard to write a policy that covers all use of force because every incident is so different, and you can have descriptors about the use of force in there, but I always say, there's some things that really have to be in use of force, but it's really hard to articulate in a policy all the possibilities. And use of force is based on really a couple different court decisions. The first one was the Garner versus Tennessee. That's the juvenile that ran from a burglary when shot in the back. The officer believed he had probable cause for a felony. The court ruled, yeah, but that's a seizure and it's excessive force in that case. And then the one that most everybody talks about is Graham versus Connor. I'm not going to read this verbatim. I think you had it 2 weeks ago a little bit as well. But basically, it's the overriding principle of how force is going to be judged by the court. And then you develop your policies around there. What's interesting about Graham versus Connor, and people talk about it all the time, and here's how we came up with our policy, is Graham versus Connor, as I go, offers little guidance on actual use of force. It kind of says, here's how we're going to judge it. It doesn't tell you if someone comes at you with their hands clenched and are swinging at you that you can use a nightstick. It doesn't even go into that. The decision was about 10 pages long, actually. And very little of it actually talked about the force. It just talked about how we're going to judge these cases. So policy's got to be a lot more about that. It's about, what happens out there, what we can identify, and then how do we really integrate that into our training and our core values of our agency. And a lot of places use a use of force continuum. This is just an illustration, but level 1 might be officer presence, tactical communication, maybe 2, physical control, that's arm manipulations, takedowns, those kind of things, impact weapons, and then up to deadly force. It's kind of scripted, and that makes it easier to train, but we're finding, and here's another one, this is actual kind of more of a mechanical model. The downside of these, and it'll be on the next slide, is that a lot of agencies train this way because it was easy. Someone comes at you with their hands up and they look like they want to punch you. Well, now you can mace them, you could taser them, you could use your nightstick, right? It's this action equals these force options. Easy to train, and that's why a lot of agencies really went to it. And some still use that model. I mean, a lot of agencies still use that model. And it's good for a reference, but Graham versus Connor actually isn't this. It isn't a use of force continuum. It's a reasonable standard. But this, you could say, is a reasonable standard. But then again, this is a mechanical model, and maybe if someone comes out with your hands up, you may be authorized to use a nightstick. You could also back up. You could do a lot of other things. I think you saw that body-worn camera video, I think 2 weeks ago, where the subject who looked like he was in crisis was coming after that officer. She backed up, she backed up, she backed up. She kept on creating distance, she kept on talking. If you watch the first part of that, she was really trying to work with him and de-escalate him at the beginning of that. That didn't work, and it doesn't always work, but then she kept on creating distance. However, he's coming at her. She could have used a different option, and if you're using a use of force continuum model, another option could have been used. But she didn't use that. She kept on giving up ground because she had ground to give up. And Lily, in that particular instance, I think that was a wonderful job by her. So anyway, this is what PERF says. The agency still rely on this rigid mechanical model and with escalating continuums of force. While the models have changed drastically, what we're seeing is really a bigger push to think about all options, including backing up, your positioning, all these other things. So they're moving away from it. New York PD is one of the folks that was leading the charge on this on their emergency services unit, which is, here's all the things I know, here's all the things I can possibly do. I'll show you the model a little further down here, but it's decision-based, backing up. Even though other force might have been used or could have been used and probably would have been within policy, backing up was another option, calling for additional help. And back to the lawful but awful, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So just because someone says they're going to attack you, but you have the ability to be away from them, doesn't mean you should close that gap. You could legally be justified to do it, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should. So this is really about assessing your threats at all times, thinking about what are options you might have. And that's really what the model is based on. And is the subject an immediate threat? You can't de-escalate somebody who's charging at you with a knife. If they're on you, and you're going to have to do what you have to do to keep yourself safe. However, I use the bathroom barricade example because this just happened in another agency I was reviewing. They had a suicidal subject armed with a knife. They negotiated for less than 20 minutes, and then they kicked the door in to save a guy from killing himself. But they pointed their guns at him because he was a threat with a knife. So if you think about that, he's not an immediate threat. He's locked himself in the bathroom. He's armed himself with a knife. He has no access to victims. Why are we going in just 20 minutes? It's something to think about. So are there other options? Can you get a mental health worker out there? Is there somebody who actually has a real connection with this guy? What is the crisis he's in now, and is there a way we can mitigate it? And is now the time? And then if another thing, and this really catches the media a lot, but we're also seeing trained a lot now, is that if option A doesn't work, don't keep doing it. And I think the most famous one I always see is the officer or the subject's on the ground and we're hitting him with a baton and we hit him 20 times. Well, if it didn't work in the first 6 times, is the 20th time more likely to be successful? Or and another one we see a lot of times is officers, we don't want people with their hands near their waistline, right? So we take a subject down to the ground, their hands are buried. We call it, in some places call it turtling, there's different lexicons everywhere. They get their hands down here. We know that this is a high likelihood if someone's armed with a weapon, it's going to be in the front waistline in the belt. We know that as a danger. So I watch videos sometimes and I see officers hitting a person, trying to get the hand. One, it looks terrible, but 2, it's actually a terrible technique. You don't want to pull someone's hand out who might have a gun in it. The better technique is pinch the arm to the ground, leave it there, slowly dig and get your hands under there. You want to control the subject. You don't want uncontrolled action. But again, if that's not working, then go to something else. Same thing with taser. We've seen these cases around the country where they drive stun, and drive stunning someone is when you don't have the cartridge on, but you're literally pushing into their body as a pain compliance. It doesn't limit mobility, it just hurts. And so they do it once here, and then they do it here, and they do it here, and then they do it here, and they do it here. If it didn't work in 2 or 3 cycles, it's not going to work. Move on to something else. And that's what we see a lot of areas, a lot of places training and are covering it in our policy, which is think of other options. If it's not working, try something different. And then we're really seeing a big push is in the policy, putting the sanctity of human life in there. Because really, police work is about saving lives, and we want to save lives. And so if your policy on force doesn't acknowledge the fact that at the end of the day, you're really trying to save lives. You're using deadly physical force as the last resort, but you're using force as a last resort generally. You're trying to talk people into handcuffs. Most agencies are successful. I think the stats here are probably less than 2% of arrests and in any kind of physical force whatsoever. It's pretty close to that. I think it's less than 2. Nationally, it's less than 5. But we're looking at that. And then de-escalation clauses, that if it's feasible, I mean, to de-escalate, then you're going to try that. And that's being put into policies. And here's that critical decision-making model. This is actually borrowed from, I believe it's England, Ireland, one of the two. And it's really about the core values of the agency, which is the ethics, the values, proportionality. Proportionality is, not every use of force needs to be the maximum amount of force. It's the minimum amount of force you need to be successful at whatever technique it is. And assessing and acting, and this is almost, I don't know if anyone has ever heard that, the term, the OODA loop. Is that, a lot of trainings. Yeah, this is, the Air Force uses this. And the OODA loop is observe, orient, decide, take action. This is almost based on that a little bit, but this is what is, you're taking all the factors that you know into this, and you're trying to get these factors, by the way. You're asking neighbors, you're asking other observers, what do you see? What are you noticing about the person? I mean, in that video, the body-worn camera video from 2 weeks ago, it wasn't all the way in the end when I'm sure most people in here thought, this person's in some kind of crisis. When he started acting a little bit different and started screaming, and remember he's backing up towards that, in that grass strip, he's backing up and he's yelling and his hands are clenched. I think everybody in here realized that guy's in some kind of crisis, right? So you're taking that information in as well. And so you're making your decisions based on that. And rather than a purely mechanical model, his hands are clenched, now I can use a taser, now I can use a pepper spray, mace, or I can use a takedown. So a critical decision-making model is, what do I know about the person I'm responding to? Is it a chronic person you've gone to a lot? Was the caller told dispatch? This is really about dispatch as well, getting the right information. Have they been the subject of previous calls? Have you been out to the same location multiple times? What is the nature of those calls? What exactly is happening? All these things you want to consider, and this applies in a policy because when you're talking about decision-making models, we want people to kind of think of these things on every call they go to, because no call is going to be the same, but you can always get information on them. And so it's relevant to have this kind of thought process even when you're developing your policy on use of force. I'm not going to read through all these. I think you guys will get the slides as well. I can if you want, but a lot of it goes down to, and I think the third point from the bottom is the biggest. What are my legal authorities here? And what is governmental interest? Do I really need to do this now? If I've got a minor crime and now is not the appropriate time and I know that I can make a different time to make that arrest, is that maybe a better idea? There are times you have to act. You're forced to, but a lot of times you really want to think about that, because sometimes folks get tied up in the moment and not necessarily thinking long-term about really why are we here? Oh, this is a disturbance and it's a non-crime event, and now we're going hands-on, taking someone to the ground, and at the end of the day, you're down on the ground, you're like, well, I'm not even sure if I have a trespass now. I mean, this has happened. And so that's why we push it in policies, and we're seeing the national trend is, think about that even in your policy. What is my legal right to act here? And use of force, documenting and monitoring. These are the biggest issues I've seen around the country. There's almost everybody that's in a big city does use of force documenting and has a use of force report. And that is definitely best practice. That's what we see around the country. And monitoring. That I don't always see around the country consistently, but is where probably the best practice, and I'll go into that a little bit here. So use of force reporting, all force is documented. Usually when we say that, that's all force beyond reasonable handcuffing or minor arm manipulation. Different agencies have different thresholds, but anything where someone complains of an injury or they're taken to the ground, anything above that, automatic reporting. Documenting contributing factors, what you did, de-escalation attempts. So I'm not seeing that in as many agencies now, but I am starting to see it on the use of force form, where folks are actually documenting what de-escalation technique they thought about and why it wasn't relevant. And so you're documenting that actually on the front page of it. So, you thought about using pepper spray, but it was windy out, or you were in a small closed area, those kind of things. And then, we tried to talk, yes, sir.
About that use of force. So are there any repercussions? You show the list of like steps 1 through 5, but if someone just goes from 1 to 5 and bypasses all of the other steps, and it's deemed that well, I mean, this could have been handled in a different way? Is there any kind of accountability, any repercussions for that?
There is, but there's nothing, even in the mechanical use of force model, there's nothing to say that you couldn't go from 1 to 5, or even start out at 5, where you pull up to a call and you do no more than start to get out of your car and shots are fired at you. You're at 5 already. But there's also times where you might be talking to somebody at the side of a car and you're just trying to get driver's license information and you've used no force. You get a little bit of argumentation. You don't know that this person just committed a crime. They know that. And all of a sudden they're pulling a firearm on you or something else. But
I hear what you're saying. That's kind of not what I'm asking.
Okay.
Like, I mean, yeah, if you getting out of the car and someone's shooting at you, I mean, of course you're at 5. I'm talking about if the situation's been deemed that the individual that has been shot or deadly force has been used against him was never at a level 5, but the officer went from 1 to 5. Is there any accountability or any kind of repercussions?
yeah, I mean, an officer could be charged for that. Obviously, that'd be excessive, depending on circumstances. And even if it's not to level 5, but even back to a tasering, there are a lot of places, and I know the Ninth Circuit's different than you guys are in the Sixth Circuit here, but with the use of a taser, you have to give a warning if practical. So you couldn't just walk up to somebody, even though they might be somebody who's got their hands clenched, you think they're an imminent or immediate threat, and then tase them without giving a warning. In the West Coast, you actually have to give the warning if you can.
Yeah.
And so that could be a violation of a policy. And a lot of places will have that in their policy for taser specifically, or electronic control device, that a warning must be given if possible.
Yeah, and I guess I asked that question because, and it doesn't necessarily have to be to a level 5 with deadly force, just any of those levels. Will it do police forces will they hold, or is there things in place that can address that officer to hopefully prevent it ever escalating to and to a level 5 or something like that? If there's continual cases where, man, this has been reviewed, you went from here to 3 or whatever when the situation didn't seem to warrant that. That's I guess kind of.
Hopefully, we get caught on the first one, because all the use of force in most agencies is read, and a sergeant responds to the scene, and say you're arguing about a ticket with me, and we're arguing, and the next thing I probably couldn't take you down, but maybe when I was 20, I maybe no, but then all of a sudden I take you down. So I've jumped from just having mere presence, trying to use some verbal judo on you to try to get you to just accept the ticket, and without warning, I grab you and throw you on the ground. That's going to be a violation of policy, and that's going to be excessive force by most department standards. And so most likely an officer would be held accountable for that. But you jumped ahead of like 3 slides, I think. I'm going to get to that in a second, because it's an important part that I don't see all agencies doing, but I see more progressive ones doing it. So I think you wrote slide 2 ahead of here.
Oh, okay.
So, and let me see here. So, no, actually we're on this slide. Early intervention systems. This is a big push that we're seeing around the country. And the Columbus Division of Police has EARS, which is the Early Action Review System, and they meet about every 6 months. The true EIS system is actually real time. And what it does is you can put any kind of threshold you want in there. And a lot of times they do it by division and by area and by even unit assignment, like nights, days, whatever it was. In fact, I'll tell you how it happened to me. I used force one time as a sergeant. I hadn't used it in 2 years, and I had to go sit down with my lieutenant because I was 100% over the norm for my assignment. Automatically, before I'm even back to the office, he got an early warning system hit on me for being 100% over use of force from the previous year. Because we only had it set at 1 because I was a sergeant. So early intervention is probably a key to this. And the sooner you can act, the better you can act. And with early intervention systems, you don't just look at use of force. You look at a lot of other things. And with it, though, you can track a lot of other variables. And those ones are really important. They can be complaints. Did you get 2 complaints in 30 days? Or is it 90 days? Whatever you want to set as a department. A lot of times we look at overtime. Not everybody tracks overtime. But someone who doesn't get a lot of sleep can be a little bit crabby, right? And we, in my old department, we actually looked at overtime usage, and we would track that with complaints or use of force. It'd be something to look at. Wow, this guy's worked 35 hours extra this week, and he got 2 use of force complaints this week. Is there can we say it's related? Maybe, but it's certainly worth the discussion. Also tracking crashes and lawsuits. And really important, this goes back to officers' mental health. We also started tracking critical incidents where there was child abuse or officer injured or death. So you went to a violent crime scene. So we were tracking that to see if maybe, is there a pattern that you've been to like 3 baby deaths in the last month and a half, and now all of a sudden you're with a child abuse suspect and they get dumped somehow. I mean, we can't always put those things together, but we also could say that that person may be in a little bit of a crisis. They may be a little spun up because they've seen some really bad things. And that's unfortunate about police work is you don't get to choose what you see and you can't erase it. You see it once and it's in your head forever. And you like everything you do, right? You'll remember it. But some things will be ingrained in you for a lifetime. And those, we think, can have an impact on officers down the road. Whether it's PTSD or other things. So some agencies will track that as well, the critical incidents. And then, like I said, if the threshold is met, they may assignment to the supervisor to conduct a preliminary analysis. This doesn't mean you're going to reevaluate all the uses of forces, but you will actually go back and look at them and see is there a pattern. Well, look at this. Officer Smith had 3 uses of force this year, and now the pattern is he's making these arrests by himself without cover. As a supervisor, you could go, well, why is he not waiting for cover? We're teaching 2-on-1 control here. And this officer, he's aggressive. We get it. He's going out and doing police work, but he's got 3, and everybody else on his team who works the same shift, they're waiting for cover. They're not using as much force. We might have a sit down with them. And interesting enough, we look at tactics and other factors. Interesting enough, and I get down to the bottom here, 50% of complaints come from officers with 5 years experience or less. Now, there's 2 reasons for that. One, those are the folks who are working patrol the most, so we know that. But 2, a lot of those folks have not matured up to the point of really, taking their time and learning all the tactics. And, police work, it's hard to recruit now, I would say that. But also, we don't recruit people that are, 45 years old or, very often. Those aren't the folks we're getting in there. So these folks are learning on the job, and that's why it's important that supervision ratios are good. That's one thing we look at as we do a review, and we're reviewing CPD now, is how many sergeants on the street per officer. Because there are some big, in our preliminary, there are some big gaps in patrol where we got sergeants with a lot of officers underneath them. And you can't mentor people when you have that many under you. You can't show up on enough calls because you're going from call to call. And then having sergeants arrive on time, I skipped, I'll go back to the top bullet point. Yes, sir.
If I could back up one moment. You mentioned you can't unsee something. And law enforcement officers, as well as other first responders, firefighters, you name it, see some pretty bad stuff sometimes. We don't use the word trauma that much in police departments and professional, but we use it elsewhere, with, populations who are challenged. We're using it in prison now a lot, treating persons for trauma or counseling persons for trauma. Which says to me that, the issues, Chief, are more profound than just wellness. I know the Highway Patrol used to do debriefings every time there was a fatal accident that they had to cover and those kind of things. So I just think this topic is really important, to kind of put an asterisk next to, because, there are a lot of things that can precipitate. It's in the military, we would say PTSD. We don't mention that terminology with law enforcement that much either. But it's really important that these kinds of things that you can't unsee or at least acknowledged and, given the opportunity for those persons, and sometimes it's required, to debrief on those.
That's correct. And use of deadly physical force, a lot of departments require a a visit with a psychologist before you can come back to duty, a follow-up 6 months later, and then another follow-up a year later, right around the date. So 3 visits is a lot of times required, but usually 1 before you even go back to duty after using deadly physical force. I don't know, did you want to jump in there, Chief, or?
No, you're correct.
Okay. And then officers are, yes, sir.
Question, and maybe the chief could answer. It was like on the last slide, you were just talking about just the stuff that's tracked, how many other incidents, prior incidents, justifiable tactics, all of those things, or you even mentioned about if someone has done overtime a couple times this week and they've had use of force. So does our Division of Police are we tracking any of these things that's being shared with us today?
Everything up there is capable of being tracked. We have all the information on each one of those. Which ones apply to our employee action review system is not as inclusive, but we are talking about including sick mark-offs, secondary employments, overtime, the same thing that we were talking about in an earlier session. So we are looking at those, whether we expand that program or not.
Is that something?
Ours look at basically uses of force and citizen complaints.
Is that something looking at maybe implementing in the near future? Or, okay.
Yes, it is.
But I think the system you guys is less reactive. So it's like 6 months out, I think, is your period of time, not instant.
Criticism might have of the process right now is that we're looking in the rear. It may be 6 months or 12 months out that we go back and look at something that happened 12 months ago, and the person may have already gone from, say, a third shift job where they're working around a lot of the bars and getting a lot of uses of force. Now they're on day shift. The problem will have kind of resolved itself because they're not getting any use of force because they're on day shift, say. So that's one critical.
I guess I would ask, but why? Why is it the system? Why does it continue being like that? Especially since you said you have the capabilities to track these things. So why is it continuing to go on and it's taking this long to follow up, or 6 months down the road when this could potentially impact someone's life, whether they live or die. So yeah, I'm kind of struggling with that to say we have the capabilities to do it, but we're still, we 12 months down the road, we're reactive.
No, it's a good question. We are a learning organization, and we are looking at that and realizing that we cannot necessarily wait until that happens. When use of force and complaints occur, number one, if you're looking for a pattern, you might need to see something over 6 months because the officers aren't using force every week. It may take 6 months or a year to get 3 uses of force. And also it may take 4 months or 3 months to investigate it, send it up through the chain to where it would be in the internal affairs files where we can use it to pull that information. So that's kind of why it's looked so far back, because the information isn't available to aggregate until that time.
Okay.
Can I just
Yes,
follow up
Glenn.
with a question? I think my memory is when we had the EARS presentation was that there are some kind of technological impediments that to get, for example, that data on absences and to link it to data on the use of force. Just getting the reports out of one system into the other seemed like it was a challenge that was being wrestled with.
It is a challenge. We have one individual in the department that's really good technology-wise in getting that information, and he's not even in that assignment. We kind of rely on him to help pull it. So technology is an issue for us that this commission could certainly take a look at.
All right. So I left off a supervisor ratio is important. So really having enough sergeants out there to actually supervise and mentor folks. Supervision also helps with making a plan. A lot of times it slows things down. Coordinating resources. If you have an officer who's only been on for 2 years and this is their first big deal and they're officer in charge, having a sergeant, they don't have to be a micromanager, but they might say, hey, have you considered bringing a canine to this? Hey, did you think about this? And this is actually, what I'm totally against micromanaging, and what I'm trying to say is that the sergeants help as a resource. Then they can develop folks to think in a more tactical approach because they have years of doing it, and they can really help. And then a post-incident debrief. SWAT teams have been doing this for 30-plus years. They go to an incident, they resolve it, then they get around together and they talk about what went well, what could be improved upon, what personal failures they had, what they did wrong as individuals. I mean, they're some of the most highly critiquing folks you'll ever meet in a post-debrief. But a lot of times as officers and sergeants, we finish that call, Officer Smith's taking so-and-so to jail, we get in our cruisers and we walk away or drive away. But really, what's super important is doing a post-incident debrief. When you have just a minute or two, getting the sergeant around, hey, here's what we could have done better. You were yelling and you were yelling, and really we want one person communicating. You're both yelling at this person who's in crisis. That's not helpful. Next time, let's designate a talker. And you learn from it. So the next time you go there, this is in your head. So you're continually learning. So those are really important. That's a big push we're seeing in other agencies, is doing that post-incident debrief on anything that has more than 4 or 5 officers there. And then if not on scene during the use of force, sergeants need to arrive shortly thereafter. That's a primary responsibility. If force has been used, they got to have a quick response to document it and find witnesses, community members, and then do the administrative review. So sergeants respond, and it's required for anything above mere handcuffing. So, and generally, that's a policy we see almost across the country without exception, is anything above mere handcuffing. Interview subject of force if possible, document injuries or lack of injuries, take photos, those kind of things. Interview witnesses, community members, and officers, and I think it's super important to get a lot of feedback in there. You can't just interview officers and this is what he did. You got to interview as many people as you can. You're doing an administrative review. Yes, sir.
So back a couple slides, you had a list of items that were tracked by the system right here. I noticed overtime is there, but is there a track of, or are you seeing trends in tracking of how many runs an officer does inside of their shift? So not necessarily in an overtime scenario, but I think a couple at the beginning, they said we do like 1.2 million a year divided by how many officers on the ground during an 8-hour shift. So the question is that also a variable in the state of mind or stress level potentially of an officer who's, may be involved in use of force?
I think it could be. I mean, I haven't seen any agencies tracking that. That's not saying there isn't one that is, but that's not one I've seen track. I've seen folks track more than this, though. This is just kind of an illustrative list, but yeah. If you're going from call to call to call, you're going to get burned out. And sometimes when you get burned out, you make poor decisions. And some of those can be use of force decisions. All right. So, in use of force, there's a narrative written by the officer. What did you do? How'd you do it? Why'd you do what you did? And then a sergeant looking at all the reports. And if there's multiple officers on scene, you might be reviewing multiple reports. And then they're going to write a summary of what happened and really look at it. And for policy violations, and if they're doing their job, I think they're also looking at tactics, saying, within policy, but the tactic of moving from behind the car to this person, maybe you should have waited back and discuss it with Officer Jones. That's a good debrief, because they're not always perfect, and everything might be justified, but you might have made a tactical decision that wasn't the best or could be improved upon. And then that goes through the chain of command. All these use of force, I know it does here as well, but it usually at most best practices goes away the chain of command that, usually up to a deputy chief level, where at least someone's looking at it higher up than the sergeant, and usually higher than the lieutenant. So deadly use of force, I think you had a presentation a little bit about that 2 weeks ago. It's done a couple of different ways around the country, and there's really no one way. It's a standard practice. Some of that has to do with the size of the agency and then the politics that are local. But they're always handled by detectives. Some places it's all in-house, where they have their own detectives go out interview and do their own interview and their own investigation on their own deadly use of force. And that's really common with large agencies. And there's good and bad with that. One, those folks are highly trained. A lot of times in a larger city, they've done a lot more of these type of investigations, so they're very professional. And they know what to look for. They've written those warrants 1,000 times. They're used to interviewing folks. Usually that's supervised by a district attorney who is usually assigned immediately to an officer-involved shooting where deadly force is used, because they're going to oversee it. Ultimately, that's going to be their agency is going to be looking at that. Sometimes they're handled by an outside agency. There has been a move for around the country where folks have had an outside agency come in and do it. There's good and bad with that as well. The good is it seems like, well, nobody's, it's not in-house. These folks have no tie to this community. They're going to look at this and be unbiased, and they're going to do a thorough investigation. However, if you have an agency that comes in here and they had 2 homicides in the last 4 years, and now you're asking them to do an investigation in a homicide or officer-involved shooting, they may not have done many of these, if at all. And you do not want to mess up an investigation in an officer-involved shooting. You want it to be the best investigation this agency has ever produced. And so bringing in outside agencies, sometimes you could have that happen. And then I see a hybrid model. I see this a lot, and this is usually the mid to smaller departments. And that's because they don't have enough homicide investigators to assign to an officer-involved shooting. And it also brings a little bit of transparency. So they'll say, we're going to take 2 officers from the county, we're going to take 2 officers from the city next door, and we're going to have 4 of your detectives, and you guys are going to be the case agents for this officer-involved shooting. So I see that a lot more in smaller and mid-sized departments because it's really actually a resource issue at that point. Again, these are all, subject to what does it look like to the community, though? And so that, it's a discussion, I think, for each community. I mean, I can't say there's a best practice here because I see it done different ways around the country.
So I didn't hear you say any or mention any community member alongside an officer in the review of these cases. Is there any precedent for that type of arrangement?
There is, and it's near the end of this presentation. And then all officer deadly force should have an administrative review. Now, some places just do the administrative review to look for policy issues and see if, was the officer, were they qualified to use their handgun? When did they last qualify? Did they violate any department policies? The bigger trend is having a training review. And I'll use myself as an example, and I'm not saying we were best practice, but on officer-involved shootings, we actually sent a training lieutenant to each one of those the night of the incident to actually walk the scene, to be out there with the detectives, and we're looking at only from tactics and training. And at the end of the day, we presented to a civilian and police board. It was a dual board, but we presented this was in compliance with what we train, or this was out of compliance with what we train, or this was almost to what we train. So we go through it step by step. And we hold people accountable. I can tell you in one, it was a lack of supervision. And obviously the sergeants didn't like my outcome of it, but there was 2 sergeants on the air, and it turned into a shooting. Not one of them took charge of the incident, and we knew it was an armed guy who just fired shots at somebody, and they had been following him for a while, and the 2 sergeants on the air never took control. So they were held to task for not supervising. I can't tell you what the outcome of their discipline was, but that was something as a training review we looked at. It's like, what were the tactics, and here was the poor tactics. And we also described the tactics. In that particular incident, we had 2 different tactics being deployed because of lack of supervision. We had someone who was closing the encounter, and we had people who were standing off. So we had officers who were trying to narrow in on a suspect who was in a crowded 7-Eleven, and we had officers who were actually stationed about a block away, walking in and observing. So we had 2 different deployment strategies because no sergeant took charge, and it resulted in a fatal shooting. It may have turned into a fatal shooting anyway because of other things we knew of, but the bottom line, in that particular incident, we didn't have someone doing the right thing. And so in that room, that's basically how we decided, or how I described it as the training lieutenant. Here's what happened, here's what we trained, and here's what they did, and this didn't meet it. And so that's really important, and that's, again, the tactics, all the way up to the use of force. Civilian oversight boards. So there has been a big push for these around the country. And again, I sent to Elon, but there is I think it's like 12, 13-page thing from the major city chiefs that was put out. It was funded by COPS, but it looked at civilian oversight boards. So some departments have civilian oversight boards. The boards vary in scope and authority. Some civilian oversight boards only look at complaints. If you complain and it goes through the department's process and you don't like the outcome, you can appeal that to the civilian board who will look at your complaint, look at the investigation, and they can either ask for more follow-up or they can overrule it, the decision. The other ones actually are investigative, where they will actually do the investigation of the officer for complaints. And with use of force, I have not seen an integration to that point where where citizens go out to the scene and be part of that investigation or oversee it in any way. I have not seen it anywhere, but we are seeing more and more involvement. So NCOLE is the National Association of Community Oversight for Law Enforcement, I think that's correct. And they have 125 jurisdictions around the country that have some sort. Membership of major city chiefs, MCCA, I'm sorry, I have these acronyms in here, is major city chiefs, and this is all the really large agencies like Columbus, Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, Portland. 79% of their members say they have some kind of civilian oversight, whether it's a board or something else. Three main types is investigative focus model. There's a few of those. Review focus model, there's a few of those. And then the auditor model, which is everything has already been investigated and they look at it. So I will, and that study was done just last year. And so investigative focus model involves the routine independent investigations and complaints against officers. Again, I haven't seen it for use of force, specifically deadly use of force, maybe use of force at a lower level, but not deadly. And it may replace or duplicate police internal affairs processes. They actually might hand out your own subpoenas, your appearance in front of the board. And a lot of times they have non-sworn civilian investigators assigned who would do the initial intake. Yes, sir.
So when you're talking about civilians, are you talking about just like random people on the street, or are you talking about former prosecutors or attorneys who are trained in that kind of investigation?
All of the above. And so, we've had them with who are defense attorneys who actually serve on, those boards. The other part of that is that there's training involved in it, and I'll get to that as a slide down the way here too. And it really depends on the agency, but a lot of them will give them a lot of leadway, train them how to do the actual investigation and the questions asked, and they'll do them. And they'll be with a trained person. Some places who just start these out will actually ask for a mix of staff. They'll actually recruit prior law enforcement and non-law enforcement to train up the non-law enforcement, and at some point it's all civilianized, where it's non-law enforcement altogether. Did I answer your question? And then there's a review focus model, and it concentrates on looking at the completed investigation. And they'll go through the investigation and go, did you talk to, well, it looks like you only made one attempt to talk to this witness that sounded like they had critical information. We want you to go find that person. We want you to talk to them. So they'll actually come back with a recommendation to your internal affairs and say, this is not complete. This needs to be redone. Or they'll go through a series of them and look at them and go, okay, we don't think you're asking the right questions, or these questions seem biased the way you're asking them, and we'd like you to rephrase these in the future. They'll do those kind of things. And they also look at findings. What are the findings? And they'll do that kind of a look. And then that's the auditor model. And then that's a review focus. Auditor model is where they look at a whole batch of them, and they'll look at, well, they'll go, gee, this agency has 87% of their complaints are rudeness, and we're going to recommend that you get, some kind of training in customer service, and we want to address this as a community. We want to make changes. Yes.
Are any of these, they all say civilian, are any of them a hybrid model? Like we had talked about EARS as all law enforcement, but integrating a civilian component to that, or are these 100% separate around the country?
They're all done differently, and I have a slide that addresses that a little bit. But and where I was at, we had, for on use of force, we had 2 community members, and the rest was law enforcement. But they didn't do investigation. They just heard the cases that went through, and they made recommendations on the force. On the On the complaint model, and I'll use where I'm at, but this is what I've seen around the country as well, it's all civilians. And it's run out of the auditor's office, and they do all the investigation. They do more of they're more of the review focus. So they'll look at a completed review, or if you make a complaint and you don't think it was adjudicated appropriately, you can appeal to them, and then they'll review it. And those folks are all civilian.
Follow-up question. Are these paid or volunteer positions you primarily see?
Generally, on the ones where where they do the internal affairs intake and investigation, those are generally paid. The ones that are the use of force board or overseen board is a lot of times it's voluntary. And it can be extensive 9 hours, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. So civilian oversight boards where they use the investigative model, I have a list here. This is from that manual, but you can look, there's some pretty good size agencies that do the investigative model where they have civilians actually do the investigation. This is cities with the review model where the investigation is done by the police department, but then looked at by civilian review model, civilians. And cities with the auditor model where they just take batches of the complaints and look at them for patterns. And this is a list of other, and it doesn't detail in some of the literature I've looked at, but these are ones where they might have civilians who actually can do subpoenas, but they might not do the full investigation, or vice versa. They may do a there are places that do an officer and a civilian do the interview. So you can see there's just a big variety.
John?
Yes, sir.
So do we have any records of which of these models is the oldest? And the reason why I ask is because I wonder, is there any information or data on how this has impacted building trust and legitimacy? Like, so has it been effective? Because I think that it follows logic that this would be the end objective of putting a civilian oversight board in place, is building that trust. So I'm just wondering what the data says about the efficacy.
You actually got to my next slide after this. They are looking at trying to test that and research that, and I believe there will be a grant coming out from the Department of Justice on that. Review boards have been around since the 1960s. Los Angeles is one of the first, and then I also believe it was Wichita was one of them. And in the material that I sent to Elon, and because I couldn't quote all here and do it in the time allotted, but there's a PDF that I sent him that will have it on there, and it will tell you which one's the oldest, but it started around the 1960s with some of these folks. So here are the issues, some of the things to talk about. There's no empirical evidence they work, and I'll tell you and I'm going to give you my personal experience, but this is also sort of a national trend from other folks I talk to. We have civilians who've dedicated hours and hours and hours of looking at police use of force and sit on these boards and read multi-hundred-page packets put together on an officer-involved shooting, and there are members of the community who think that we bought and paid for them, even though we didn't pick them. They were picked by the mayor's office or city council members, but they think that because they sit in the same table with us, that their decision is biased by us. But there are folks think it's great that you have them on there, that it's an independent person looking at it. So there's no real empirical evidence that builds trust. It seems intuitively that it would, but again, sometimes we're talking about the margins. There are some folks who will never believe that person would make an independent decision on the use of force. And there are other folks that believe that police can do no wrong, and why having civilians even a part of it, because police are perfect. So you have those spectrums. So I don't know. I know that in the research I was looking at, DOJ wants to actually study this. They want to know if it changes, and what they're talking about doing is those 500-person, studies about what do you feel, and talking to agencies who have a use of force oversight board or civilian oversight, and see if it actually changes the feeling within the community. But I think it helps transparency. Large time commitment. Some of these boards are non-paid, and the one I know one important one was non-paid. And we literally had folks that would have to come up because we couldn't give them the homicide packet to take home. They literally had to make an appointment to come see us and then sit in my office and read sometimes 800-900 pages worth of documentation and watch video over and over again. And it's their time. And literally, it's a lot of hours because in the end, they're voting whether they think it was in policy or justified. And in training, yes, sir.
So we kind of talked about trust from the point of view of the community. Is there any research or evidence on kind of the point of view of the officers? Because one worry, right, is if you're an officer and there's some random person that you're relying on to read 900 pages, that it might change behavior. We talk a lot about the Ferguson effect, depolicing, and officers changing their behavior in response to anticipation of this kind of review. Is there any evidence on that?
I didn't see that. I think that there's sometimes, at the grassroots level within some law enforcement folks who don't like to change. Even de-escalation to some folks is like, de-escalating is just going to get officers killed. And in fact, if you search, Google de-escalation, there are some articles in there written by officers who think that it's going to get officers killed. But it's really about time, tactics, and it's really about good tactics. We're not telling people to de-escalate when someone's coming at you with a knife. But some people take it to that step and write about it. And so with these oversight boards, I haven't seen that. I think some officers choose to go to the oversight board, by the way, and they can make a statement. Some will just sit there, and I know that some that have had to kill someone in the line of duty felt embarrassed. Not only did they have to be in front of their peer group, they had to be in front of two people they didn't know. And they expressed that to me. Then I have to explain why I did what I did to these two random people I don't know, because you don't know them when you're police department. They just show up on the board. The chief knows them, and other folks know them in the ranks, but the officer on the street doesn't. So, but I haven't seen a change that way.
I guess it seems like it's a delicate balancing act, because you need a process that's transparent and has trust from the community, but you also need a process that looks transparent and has trust from the officers themselves. And finding that balance seems potentially kind of tricky.
And I also think it would depend on whether the civilian, say you had 9 people on it, and 5 were civilians and 4 were command staff. I think officers would feel a lot different about it than versus, from my personal experience, where there was 2, but there were like 7 voting members. So they couldn't overturn a decision on their own. I think that would change, that balance would probably change with the officers, how they felt. Training involved, yes, sir.
So we spoke with several members of the Denver version of this of an oversight board. I don't think they call it that. One of the things that they do that intrigued me, because I think when you say oversight, it almost appears as if it's a kind of a gotcha board where we're trying to find things going wrong. Their version of this is that they're trying to find officers who do things right, and they want to document those. Is that a part of the strategy, or is that typically
in a use
adversarial?
In a use of force board, not so much. I don't ever see that happening. But in the model that I went out with, if someone wanted to make a accommodation for an officer, you would get a thing from the Independent Police Review Committee, would send you a thing saying, Mrs. Smith thought you did a great job with the barking dog call, and you'd get it in your file. So they did do both. They could take complaints. It was probably weighted 90-10.
Report form.
Yeah.
Says, what, it's not just bad. You have to pick. Is this a good report, or is this a report of something that you disliked?
Well, in the ones I've seen generally have been, it's either a complaint or you're making a accommodation about an officer and you're reporting to that board. But as far as with use of force, I haven't ever seen any agency or board come out with saying the officer did a great job here. It's usually you were justified.
Yeah, I mean, if it's use of force, but I think if it's just everyday policing, community policing or otherwise, that there should be a strategy to report the good things that happen.
Absolutely. So training was the big issue with this because you got to bring people up to speed on use of force, the policies of the agency, and that's a big time commitment for a lot of folks. And then trust, internal and external, which you were getting at, which is having civilians on the board, at least having a look at it who are, appointed by the mayor or somebody else, gives the ability to say, we have folks that are non-police reviewing this use of force. And then there's an expense. It depends on how you do it. I mean, if you have paid investigators at the investigative level, doing the complaint intake, that can be expensive, otherwise it's not. And then timeliness. One of the things that came out in the study from the major city chiefs was that when you involve civilians, because they weren't getting paid to be on some of these boards, the timeliness of scheduling a meeting when everybody could be there would sometimes back up a use of force where you're looking at it 18 months post. So you got an officer who's already, been through a deadly force encounter. They, done the healing that they're trying to do. And now 18 months later, I got to go back in front of a board and explain what I did on this day that I just was trying to kind of forget. So there is that component of it, that it can affect timeliness of the investigations and completing the whole process. Because when you're in a deadly force incident, and I can't speak for everybody, but when you're done with that whole process, it is like bricks lifted off your shoulder. You've completed it, and now you can move on. Whether you may still have feelings about what happened, but I think when you're done with that process, for a lot of officers, you're like, whew, I'm so glad it's over. And it justified, your life was threatened, and you did the right thing. To have it being brought up 2 years later could, I think, be stressful to some officers. I think it could be looked at that way. Yes, sir.
May.
So it's my responsibility to manage the time. And so could you give me, because an idea of how much longer you are, because I know we also have committee meetings. I don't mean to interrupt, and I want to be able to leave time for questions. So if you could just.
I can be done in the next 2 minutes because I think there's only 2 slides left.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just had a comment because while I'm sensitive to the impact that it may have on the officer, if a loved one is killed, that lasts a lifetime for the survivors in that family. So
Yeah,
not to say that they should be subjected to like some undue length of time or unfair. However, I think we should also that should be raised as a counterpoint.
I think that's a great point, but also even with that same point is we could be re-traumatizing the loved ones of the deceased, because now 2 years later, they're still in the air. This hasn't been reviewed internally. We have this oversight board is going to look at it, and now 2 years, if you're not doing it timely, you may re-aggravate wounds as well, not just for the officer, but for members of the community, and especially in a highly charged incident. It brings up old feelings and old wounds, and that can work against you sometimes. I'm just putting out this timeline. This is what the Major City Chiefs was saying is one of the impacts of it.
Absolutely. I just wanted to raise that because
it's
you lose a loved one.
It's a great point, sir. Great point. All right, de-escalation, just going to do it real quickly. This guy looks like he needs some de-escalation, and I'm not going to attempt it now, but there's just some real fundamentals of it. But it's just taking action, communicating verbally and non-verbally during a potential force encounter to try to stabilize it and reduce the chance you're going to use force. It's not a new concept. It's not thoroughly researched either, by the way. There's only one actual research paper on de-escalation, and it was on nurses and working with folks in the ER, I believe. But some of the concepts come right out of CIT, which is crisis intervention training. And really it is about the crisis cycle. Everybody's been in one. You've been in one. It's usually temporary. And the introduction of authority, police can escalate someone who's in a crisis cycle already. The introduction of a uniform and authority can do that. So you got to be aware of that. And like I said, almost everyone experiences it at some point. And the techniques we are teaching folks, and we're seeing this around the country, is tactical repositioning, moving away. Get distance that equals times, that gives you options. Slow, lowered voice, non-threatening commands. Positive reassurance. Designate one talker. There's nothing worse than having 5 people yell at you when you're already in a crisis. It doesn't help. So designate a talker to do that. Build rapport and trust. Keep talking to them. If you get your name, get that name going. Slow things down. If there's not an immediacy to act and you've taken a tactical reposition where you got time, slow it down. What's the hurry? Questions? Yes, ma'am.
You reviewed a lot of trends and best practices, and I appreciate your review. As I was listening to that, and as I was listening to the commissioner's question that, it made me wonder if there's any national information or research on departments that have conducted organizational cultural evaluations and assessments, and how that would impact the acceptance of those best practices and the implementation of those best practices. And in reality, if those best practices would be accepted from the line on up to the command staff.
I'm not aware of one, but there is a lot of research out there. I didn't look that up. I wouldn't be surprised if there might be, because a lot of times when we're bringing in chiefs or you're changing an department, it's a cultural shift. So I wouldn't be surprised if someone actually looked at that, but I don't know for a fact.
Is part of the matrix report going to include a comparison of this information on best practices and what we received at our last commission meeting?
Yeah, a little bit of that. So we're going to be looking at some of the things the training division is doing. And a lot of it, some of this is staffing, but it's best practices also, community outreach and those things. So yeah, we're going to be definitely touching on that. Obviously, I've reviewed a lot of the training documents and a lot of policies already. So.
Actually, I had quite a few, but I'll ask this one first. Is in your research, what role does race, size, gender play in the mechanical use of force? Meaning, if the demographics change, do we perceive the subject actions differently? And if so, have you seen in your research the ways officers respond based on those demographic changes? How does that get addressed, or is it monitored in any way?
It is monitored, and that's one of the things that I think it was actually covered 2 weeks ago, is as the use of force and by demographics. As far as the training, if you're doing de-escalation training, I haven't seen anything that suggests that's used any differently on the demographics, but I don't know that specifically has been actually researched. I haven't heard anyone actually say that we researched this and said it's going to have this effect based on demographics.
And so connected to that, one of the things that you said was if something isn't working, move to something else. Does that mean to move up the continuum or try something else within the same threshold of the continuum?
It would mean same threshold or even down or up. The bottom line is, if what you're trying is not working, you need to do something different. And if the threat has not increased, then it shouldn't be a step up generally, right? Because the threat has not increased. So you should be trying a different tactic. So I think the point I was trying to make is that if you're striking somebody and it's having no effect and you're trying to get their arm out, maybe you should move to a pain compliance move. Maybe you should do a twist of the hands or the fingers or something else that's in that continuum or in that same threshold of threat that might be more effective, rather than just trying to do the same thing repeatedly. Does that make sense? Because it doesn't mean go up. Because if the threat hasn't gone up and you decided this tactic is this level of threat, I'm just saying if a strike isn't working, maybe something else in that same general, threshold would maybe be more effective.
Right, because so the reason why I ask is that in training around that is very important, right? Because if I hear you say do something differently, and I know that me bashing someone's head isn't working, then what else am I going to do other than go up if I feel like that's already, the most intense thing that I can do?
Well, I'll give you an example of the turtling, the person with the hands underneath their waist. You want those hands out. You don't know what's in them. You've seen someone hitting them. Give me your hands. Give me your hands. Well, you can do an elbow pressure in the back of somebody's, tricep, and put your weight on that, pinching their arm down. That's actually very painful, especially if it's against concrete. That's not a strike. That's a different tactic. It's pain compliance. It hurts, and that might yield you what you need. If that's not working, maybe you're going to reach underneath their hand and you're going to try to do a finger manipulation where you can twist their hand. And it's your skill level as well. You don't want to reach your hand underneath there if you're weaker than they are and they got better hand control. But you got to think of these different things. And just like what we're trying to, and I think nationally trying is, if you're striking someone 6 times and you didn't get the result you need, you don't strike them 20 more times. If you taser someone 3 or 4 times and you don't get the compliance you need, you don't just keep on hitting them and hitting them and hitting them and hitting them. You're getting nowhere. You're not effective. And it looks terrible, and it's not the right thing to do.
Right.
Move on. Try a different tactic in that same zone and see if you can get better compliance.
Yeah.
Now, if things change, and this is what we want officers to really think about, is adapting, and I think Seattle covers it well too, is that modulating your use of force. If all of a sudden all they're doing is, if they started out swinging at you and you were authorized to use a strike of some sort, and now you got them on the ground, and now we're in this static event where they're turtling, but they're not kicking you, they're not biting you, and they're not punching you, should we still be just sticking you? We're not in that saying, we're modulating. We should be coming down and doing something different. I ran out of time, but
No,
sorry.
Any questions from commissioners, we will just have to go over, but I do want to cover some things. But this is an opportunity for the commissioners to really ask the questions that need to be asked. Pastor?
Yeah, so just, I have a question, and you mentioned threat. And this kind of goes back to our second meeting. I think it was around our second meeting. It was here. Of course, you weren't here then. But it was a statement that was said that has really troubled me, and I have a question. I want to know if that's kind of universal. And the statement that was made was that when we were talking about, I guess kind of talking around this line, it was the question, well, the statement that was made was that the officers are trained, to not respond to the action, but respond to the threat. And I mean, that statement has really troubled me. I wasn't satisfied with the answer I got then. I want to know, is that a universal training for all officers? And then what if the action is not the threat? I'm still trying to figure out, well, what determines what the threat is?
I don't even think I understand the question. What do you mean by action?
So I think I can share a little. And early on during this process, when we saw the use of force continuum that the CPD uses, one of the things that we were told is that exact thing, like verbatim, is that the officer's response are not always just response to person does X, so now you do this, as much as there are responses to it's perceived that a person is a threat, and so that is what precipitates officer response.
Were they talking about the action-reaction principle? Yes. Okay. So there's a group out there called Force Science. They're controversial in some ways, but they've done a bunch of studies, and whether you buy into it or not, is that, and I can tell you, as being a guy who wrestled for 7 years competitively and did judo, whoever initiates an action has the advantage, generally in a physical confrontation. And so the action-reaction principle is that if you start an action, I have to, back to that OODA loop, I have to observe it, I got to orient to what it is, make a decision, and then act. But I will always be slower than the person who initiated the action. And that's where they're pulling a gun out or doing the other action. But in a physical sense, that is what we do train officers on, that reaction-action principle. But again, you got to be able to articulate what the real threat is. And just a quick hand movement is not a threat. There's got to be other things that go along with that. And so if that was what we're talking about, and of course I'm quarterbacking, I didn't hear the conversation entirely, but I wouldn't be concerned about that so much as in the use of force continuum as I would be the training of having officers identify, you know, if I'm closing the distance, my reaction time is less. That's why we talk about that distance equals time equals options. Because if you're talking about action-reaction, I have a lot more reaction time if I take a better tactical approach, which is what I think they're teaching here, and I know they're teaching it nationally, which is why would you go up on a potential threat and stay back from it where you actually have the reaction time? I'm not sure if I addressed that the way you wanted it addressed, but I'm trying to get there. Am I missing it, sir?
Not really, but.
Jason, does it help to clarify? I think what you're saying, what we talked about before, is the perception of the threat, that an action may or may not be a threat. You're talking about the perception of what that threat is, not
Yes.
what the action is itself.
Yeah, I guess you could say, for me, I'm thinking that a person's action would determine the threat level.
Agreed.
Is what I would think. But it was stated that we don't respond to the action, we respond to the threat. And my thought process is, well, shouldn't the action be the threat? And then I gave an example of a scenario that that I pulled that you could pull up on YouTube, and it was done in a state somewhere out on the west, and it was an open carry state, and they were doing a scenario. They were doing some kind of some people doing some kind of a scenario, and there was a white gentleman who was walking down the highway in the open carry state with an AR-15, and the police pulled up and got out and just started talking with him and asking him to well, can you put the gun away? Can you come talk with us, share with us all this? But he refused to, and saying, I'm not breaking any laws, this, that, and the other. And so they eventually just let him go. Then they did that same scenario, but the only difference was same street, same gun, everything, was that they no longer used a white guy, but they did it with a black gentleman. And he's walking down the street again, and immediately the officers got out, guns drawn, ready to shoot if he doesn't get down on the ground, this, that, and the other. And so, just hearing that we don't respond to the action, we respond to the threat, that bothered me as a black male, when I think of it in light of scenarios like that. And then even when that's why I asked the question, is that universal, the teaching? And then also, I guess I was waiting to hear as well, anything about implicit bias when you're talking about the trainings and things that you've looked at, where does that fall into this? Because I think that's a major concern.
I think it falls into this from A to Z. And I talked to Elon about this a little bit on the phone. I didn't put it in my presentation, but in these scenarios when you're developing, and of course I'm running out of time, and so I apologize for that, but one of the things that we did in our training division is we switched role players around frequently with our new recruits. So the apartment manager was the African-American male, the guy acting up in the apartment was a white guy. Then we changed it around, and it's a 70-year-old gal in there who would be your normal, drunk, with a handgun. And the officers, it's like, they're thinking what we see and what we hear and what we've been biased with. And all of a sudden, that's not what they're seeing in this scenario. They're seeing this 70-year-old lady, and they're thinking the whole time, because we're careful about how we script these things, and that's what's important, is we script it. There's an individual in there. They work at the construction site down the road. Every night at 6 o'clock, they start drinking hard, and today they came out and threatened me, and then they walk back inside. I know they got a bunch of guns. And the officers walk up, and it's a 70-year-old looking lady in there, and that's not what they expect to see. And the complainant is was an African-American male who happened to be there. And then in the mental health crisis, we rotate those positions around intentionally because we don't want someone to adapt, it's this or it's that. Or this is, and the implicit bias. And I think you've got to do that. And that's, that is a training that's going around a lot as well, as even in the actions of officers, we're also seeing a move, and I didn't put it in here as well, as, procedural justice training. I'm seeing more and more places doing that mandatory as well. And that goes right into it. So I get your point, and it is valid. And I think that it's something you really got to build into your scenarios. You've got to have folks who are not, we're going down a path thinking X because of X. They got to be going with, here's all the actions, and this should be my reaction given all these same actions every time.
Real quick, to address two of your issues, I'll talk to you about the AR-15 issue, because there's actually, I have some information on that. I'll talk to you about that a little bit later. I don't want to take up a lot of time, take a little time to explain it, but I'll be happy to later. On the issue of the perception, the perceived threat, what we were saying is you do not have to wait to be punched to punch back. You do not have to wait to be shot to shoot back. The perception that someone's about to punch you may be enough for you to defend yourself. And because of the recovery time, the action, reaction, recovery time, that's why that we were talking about.
Last question really quickly. Just from me. A last question for me. And it's for clarification, so it should be quickly. Does deadly use of force, when it's reviewed, does it get investigated the same way, even if no one dies or is critically injured
It should be. Yes.
Okay.
If you intentionally discharged a firearm or struck someone in the head or whatever you classify as deadly physical force, it should be investigated to the same extent.
Just real quick on that, I'm sorry. We had a case even where an officer was trying to go after someone who was a critical threat, and before the officer had taken any action, the person actually had shot themselves. And so they committed suicide. However, the officer wasn't able to stop his car in fast enough, and he ended up actually hitting the gentleman after he'd already, on video, had committed suicide. We still investigated that as a police use of deadly force.
Thank you. I've got 2 questions. I know Jason had to leave, but however many meetings ago, I brought up the Civil Service Rights Police Use of Force report, and they do say in there that specifically black teenage females are treated more aggressively than their counterparts. And I think that's what Jason's getting at, especially his comment about the perception of threat. That's been documented. So I think I'm speaking for him now, but the question is, has that been seen by you and the other studies, as we've seen in the civil rights report?
Not that specifically, and not for this report. We did do some reviews. Actually, it was university did it, which they had kids partying by a car, and they had officers respond, and it was white kids partying by a car, and they did the same exact call, and it was African American kids partying by the same call, and the interaction of the officers was completely different. So, I mean, that's just really something you got to train to, and you got to start it from day one in the academy. I mean, honestly, we all come in with our own baggage, whatever it is, and we all go through background checks, become police officers, but that doesn't mean that someone doesn't have some kind of implicit bias when they're hired. I would assume that they did, and our job as trainers is to work on that and identify it, and tell them how to work through those things. So you're training to give the right response in these types of incidents.
Agreed. I have 2 questions for you. One of them on the reporting use of force. We had a conversation at the last meeting about bicycles and horses being used as use of force, and it's not currently on the Columbus, I think 7 levels it is. Have you seen in 8 levels, thank you. Have you seen in other cities where either of those are considered specifically called out as use of force items?
So using bikes for crowd control, there's a couple different ways to use them. You can use them as a fence to keep people from going down the street. And then if you lift it up and you strike folks with it, a lot of places will call that use of an impact weapon. Not specifically a bicycle, and then when you write impact weapon, you can just write in there bicycle. And most places that do crowd control and demonstrations, everybody who's on the line does a report, and including if you didn't use force personally, but you observed it, so that you've documented it. So using it just as a static barricade, no. If you pick it up and use it against someone, that should be documented.
Okay, thank you.
Even if you don't get the person's name, by the way. A lot of places go, because you don't have time to find their name and all that, and you don't have a sergeant come to that, but you do write a report saying, I was at Smith Street on Tyler, this subject came closer to me, told him to get back, he charged me, I picked up my bike, I shoved it at him, he was wearing a green shirt and blue jeans, he ran out from the crowd, white male, 25, and here's why he did it.
Well, thanks, sir. The other question is, so
And this will be the last question. Go ahead.
let me pick a different question. No, I'm just kidding. No, this question is, most of what you've reported on are cities that are comparable in size and population to Columbus. Has there been consideration for either state, federal, or smaller jurisdiction best practices that have been lumped in with this, or are you focusing just on the same size cities?
A little bit. Some smaller agencies, I looked at some of those policies, but most of the stuff I looked at was really geared towards larger agencies.
Okay. Or federal at all?
No.
No federal? Okay.
Totally federal, I mean, I don't know if Fed is here, but run totally differently.
Sure, agreed. Thank you.
Use force is different, by the way.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure we will be seeing you again as Matrix makes its presentations to us. But thank you so much. You can see there was a lot of interest in this particular topic.
Sorry I went over your time.
That's okay. That's okay. We're now going to talk a little bit about looking ahead and the commission timelines. Are we handing out? No? Okay, all right. So I'm going to have to do this. I probably have more detail. And one of the reasons we don't share it is because things are subject to change. So, I can give you a date of April 14th, and it may change. But I want to kind of tee up the work as we see it until the reports are finalized. I do think it's pretty clear now that there will be 2 different reports. And I don't think that's what we shared with you the last time. I think we even talked about a melding of them now. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but there will be 2 separate reports, one from Matrix and one from the Commission. So now I want you to stay with me, but I'm going to go ahead and jump to the end around the timeline. I'm not even sure if I said the last time we were looking at the end of May. That's what I thought. It's now looking as if our report should be released at the end of July. So, but bear with me in terms of the pieces of work that are going to be taken care of. The week of April the 14th, we hope to have another commission meeting, and we're hoping that at that topic would be juvenile justice working with juvenile offenders. At the same meeting, we would expect Matrix to share preliminary findings that would have been shared with the mayor, public safety director, and the safety commission. So in that meeting in what I would call mid-April. I did find out today that it appears as if this information is correct, that Matrix is just beginning their various surveys. So both the community phone survey, the electronic CPD employee survey is opening. And in addition to the surveys, there's a time frame around community focus groups that probably will take place toward the latter part of April. We've talked before about having public testimony from community members. So what we're thinking of now, and there's not a date, a tentative date of May 12th, this testimony would actually take place at City Hall, and it would be run pretty much like the questions and answers of council. There would be 2 different 2-hour sessions, right now looking at the same day. So for example, it might run from 3 to 5, and then from 6 to 8. So giving the public more of an opportunity, whether it's the end of the workday or later in the afternoon. It's really important, looking at Brian and Elon, that we set that date as soon as we can to get it to you, the commissioners, but also to make sure that it is publicized wisely. It will be run pretty much like one of the meetings. 3 minutes to speak. Subjects are going to be basically focused on matrix topic items or our commission topic areas. Individuals, members of the public may also submit testimony online, and Elon and Brian or someone will be working with the Department of Tech to create an online form. So we do want to make sure that that date is out there. We should certainly know it before our meeting the week of April the 15th. Pardon? We just in the week of. No, I'm not giving you any dates. Please don't write down a single date. I'm talking, it's the week of, okay?
All right.
At our last meeting, and I think, Matthew, you were the one who raised this, and we've decided to do it this way. Commissioners should submit individual comments or recommendations. So maybe this is something where your committee is not moving it forward, but you want to share it, then you as an individual will be able to send that either to Elon or to me. And before June 2nd, we'll give you that information again, but just trying to get the time frame for you. So that's the week of June 2nd. The week of June 9, and it says the week of June 10th, but anyway, Matrix will release their report to CPD leadership, Public Safety Director's Office, Mayor's Office, and Safety Commission. And then what will happen, the commission will receive the sections that are relevant to their subcommittees. And Elon and Brian, this is why I want you to hear me very clearly. It says that report will be released the week of June 10th, but it says that the commission must submit their reports back by Friday the 21st. So I don't expect to see a report coming to us as commissioners on June 14th. I mean, we should have a solid 2 weeks. But again, as chairs of commissions, and as you're looking at your master schedules, you should be looking at setting meetings now so that you can receive those reports and then work with them. Let's see. After that, we're looking at the week of June 23rd, that the commission, I need to go back because there's at least one other commission meeting with a potential another topic. The week of April 29th, and the subject came up today, this is another subject for us. Implicit bias, impact of race. I will tell you that we really haven't decided how to present that. It could be around a panel, but that would be a second specific subject matter that we would be looking at that we haven't covered. The week of June 23rd, we're looking at 2 5-hour sessions for the commission, discussion of the full report and subcommittee recommendations. Week of July 7th, the commission report will go, let me go back. When we make our recommendations to the mayor's office and to me, there will be city staff which will begin to draft and summarize subcommittee and individual commission recommendations. So we want this report to flow as if essentially one person wrote it. You've seen that with many other reports. That will be done by city staff. But it will be delivered back to the commissioners the week of July 7th. And we'll be given some time for feedback. That was a lot. But do you see kind of the rhythm of where we're going on now? We certainly have more work as the commission body in the month of April. I mentioned 2 different weeks when we would have 2 more of these type of meetings. Some of this is driven, most of this is driven by when Matrix has shared with the mayor's office when to expect their report. We're somewhat of, I won't say reactionary, but we need it before we can go forward, as soon as we can finalize these dates, we will get them out to you as soon as possible, but especially to the chairs. If you need to speak to me again or to Elon when you know you'll need to be meeting with your committees around this work, let's make sure you have those weeks. So I would suggest that you go ahead and schedule your meetings, and then that puts the burden on Matrix and staff to get your work done on time. Any questions? Yes, LaShawn.
So at the conclusion of this process, when the final report is submitted, will we get final audience with the mayor and maybe city council president to have some discussion on just the entire process and what our experience was?
I'm sure we can make that work, can't we? Yes, we can make that work. It wasn't on the schedule.
So at the end of this entire experience, and the final report has been submitted, will we get final audience with the mayor and city council president to discuss our experience and also our findings as individual commissioners? And it sounds like they can make that happen for the group.
Not individual commissioners, but the commissioners as a whole.
As a group
Yeah,
as a
women,
whole,
yes.
but we get to speak for ourselves
Yes,
in this environment.
Yes, Brooke?
I had a question. Back early in this process, we talked about having an executive session where we just had commission members to participate, and I know we haven't done that yet. I don't know if the audience
We can do that. We can't do that because of public record.
Well, understanding that there could be, like, members of the public could come, but I know that one of the things we talked about was there are times where we've got staff members from CPD, we've got staff from public safety, and I don't know that all of our discussions.
So you're basically asking for a meeting without representation from the police department and from public safety?
I think so. I think that's what we had talked about when we initially said that there was an interest in having an executive session, so that commissioners felt free to have these open conversations and what might be very tough conversations.
Okay.
And we haven't had that yet.
Let me ask specifically, would that include Brian and Elon?
I think what we're looking for is, we just don't want someone to present I don't care who's there, if we have the public or the city staff or the chief.
You just want an open discussion.
We just want to have a meeting where there's no presentations, let's just talk.
But now, I'm hearing two different things, and I think that both can be done. But I will need to know, and I'm not saying we need to vote now, because we could have one, Matthew, certainly as you said, but I think it would be appropriate, not to offend either the police department or the safety director, to have that meeting without them. So let's just kind of think about that, folks, and kind of put it back in here, somewhere. Okay? We'll make a note of that.
So I know you said that you haven't figured out how you're going to present on race and bias or how that's going to be presented, but I'm also interested in what we do around agenda, because bias is innocent, but agenda is complicit, right? That a person brings an agenda that they seek to forward to the role of police, for instance, or some other role, and how that is addressed, how we screen for that, and how the research bears that out, like how it's identified.
I don't know if there is any research, but let me give you an example of what I think you're maybe talking about, because it's going to happen. So at some point in the, I don't know, near future, but maybe this year, candidates for police chief will be interviewed. And so are you saying that how would you get at the candidate for the police chief? What is his or her agenda? I just use that since it's at the top of the, that's going to be coming up, but it could be for anyone. But is that the type of thing in the hiring or?
Absolutely, because like I said, bias goes to something that you don't necessarily consciously act on, as opposed to agenda. The difference between persuasion and manipulation, right? That you're trying to get your agenda forward, whether it be, criminal or otherwise, rooted in racism or prejudice or.
I understand the question. For me personally, I just don't know what's out there, who could do it.
Right, and I just wanted to submit that just as a consideration as you're strategizing on how to present information around race and bias, because we know that some people enter into this space with an agenda based in their.
So I'm going to turn that back over to this side of the room as something to look at. We don't need to discuss it now unless it's a question where you want to understand Olitha's point better. But I think it's something that you can have a discussion and see if it can fit into that. Again, I'm not the person. I understand the concept, because quite frankly, there's many a day when I come into a room. For example, if I'm chairing something, when I come in, and I won't use this as an example, or even the work that I'm doing in Cincinnati, consulting. When I come into a meeting with the executive committee of the board of the United Way of Greater Cincinnati, I have an agenda. So I get the concept, completely. And so we'll just see what we can do about that. Okay? Reginald? Oh, I'm sorry, Chanel.
I was just going to touch on what Olitha was saying, because maybe I can clarify just a little bit, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think sometimes I use the best example of fraternities or sororities. I'm a member of a sorority, and sometimes people may attempt to join for the notoriety or the status, or because it gives them some sort of power and authority over another individual. So I think when he talks about agenda, he may be saying that some people seek out the policing role because it comes with it certain privileges and power that they can use to subjugate other people and to treat them a particular way that they may not have been able to do without the badge.
And I would just like, thank you for adding. However, I would also like to add to that they may also be working for the agenda of a group that they are a part of. So not just their individual agenda, but also the agenda of a group that they may have membership of or affiliation with.
And I was going to say that may be difficult to screen for, because sometimes it develops after a person gets into the organization or the agency too. So that could be a tough one.
Right, I hear that.
This light is absolutely blinding me. I can't see hands over there. Was it?
Yeah. I guess a concern that I have is once the commission sunsets we go away as a commission. Will there be a process to follow up on the recommendations, either through Matrix or the commission, to see what progress is being made, what recommendations have been adopted or not adopted, what will be the timeframes for achieving those recommendations. So I'm concerned, of course, about what happens a year after this commission has been sunsetted, and how do we get feedback on how progress is being made?
An excellent point, and we don't have it spelled out, but that really should be addressed before we finish, because I, for one, would not like to think that I would have spent well over a year, and we probably have all done this, a report that goes to a shelf, and it never sees the light of day again.
I have to tell you that has to be a part of your recommendations, because not only will you have wasted a year of your life, there are people in this community that if nothing comes out of this that's tangible, measurable, visual, you will have done more harm than good. And I appreciate the public opportunity. I appreciate the notice that you're going to give the public. And to Mr. Carter's comment, I want to add, many people, members of the public, have gone to City Council. And City Council, especially through the police union contract process, have said, this isn't our ballgame. So I think it's so important that City Council be brought into this if real change is going to happen.
Just one, sorry.
Letha and then
And what is
Matthew.
the potential impact of leadership change midstream in this process? That we bring in a new chief who has not been at the table. What is the potential impact on this work and any subsequent work done after it that could be impacted by that?
Well, Letha, I'm going out on somewhat of a limb, but it is my assumption that the work of this commission absolutely will play a role in the selection of our next chief.
Chair, I think a couple of things I'd like to share that Mayor Ginther has said previously, and it bears repeating here. First of all, both your report and the report for Matrix will be the roadmap for our chief of police, whoever that chief is. And they will, that will be a condition of having that position. And there will be a clear expectation that the community is a vital part in receiving periodic updates. The second thing that I would say, that please don't throw anything at me, the mayor has not made the decision that he would disband this commission at the completion of this work. And there could actually be some request that this commission or something like it could continue to help hold us accountable to the changes that we've committed to make. So I just wanted to share those two items, because I think it speaks to the mayor's commitment, and I think the commitment of all the folks that we need to make this change is there.
Brian, does that essentially part of that means that the timeline for our report obviously has an effect on the timeline for the hiring process? Interesting.
Potentially,
Okay.
yes.
All right. Do you mind if I continue? So 2 questions. One, going back to the meeting that Brooke, you and I were talking about, or separate meetings perhaps, do the public has to be here if there's more than 8 members available? Do the cameras have to be here?
It's not a requirement.
Okay.
So if there were requests that CTV not record, that's something that we could do.
Okay. I just think
But
that's...
it has to be noticed, right, ahead of time.
There would be public notice. If members of the public wanted to attend, we can't impede them. But there is no requirement that we do anything other than keep minutes of the meeting.
Sure. I think that may, to your point of the conversation, may make it easier for us to just have some open sharing of ideas, nothing secret, but to make it easier. My other question is, I wasn't sure if you misspoke or if I misheard or both. The dates to have the individual commissioner input, you were in the June month, but you said April 2nd.
Week of June 2nd.
June 2nd. Okay.
Commissioners submit individual comments, recommendations, the week of June 2nd.
Okay, I thought I heard you say April, I apologize. And then as we submit those, is assuming that multiple individuals on the commission may submit the same item, if we're submitting to the 2 of you, those will be combined and sent back
Yes,
out?
Well, I don't know if we're sending them back out. I don't know at this point how they're going to be used.
Okay.
I mean, at some point, I think they'll be shared, but I'm not going to say how it's going to be done today.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I just ask a follow-up? Does it make sense to get the individual comments after the full commission's report is done rather than before? Because it seems like it's not clear what we're commenting on before we know what everybody else says, right?
You've been in your committee meetings. This is what I was thinking. You've been in your specific, unless again you want to do something, outside of that. But the thought was, as Matthew and I were talking last week, especially if you're serving on a committee, I think this is what it was, not last week when we were here together. As an individual member, you may have
I got it.
an additional idea that wasn't sort of, I don't want to say approved, but it wasn't adopted
got it.
by
So-
your committee.
The
So it's-
example,
yeah.
the example I used was in the written documentation, all officers should wear bow ties, right? I don't actually think that, good example, just because that's what I feel. 10 other people could say that's a great idea, they should absolutely wear bow ties, but it doesn't fit into hot topics, it doesn't fit into hiring, it doesn't fit into training, it's just a weird thing. That's more of what.
I got it. So this was in the context of the subcommittee report. so
Yes.
that's different. Got it.
Yeah, the things that fall between.
I got it.
I don't think all officers should wear bow ties.
Any other questions or comments?
I do have one more question or comment, and that is for John. And since he said that there is no empirical evidence for these types of bodies, I know that the community oversight, could Matrix provide, or do you have any information on how we could begin tracking the efficacy of our work moving forward? How we could kind of blaze that trail in identifying what things we would need to do to begin tracking the efficacy of this?
Well, actually, I think you're at a good point, which many of the other agencies who do this weren't at, which is we're doing a community survey, and part of that is about trust with your police department. So you're new, and you didn't exist as far as an oversight board. So if you start now, you have a baseline to build upon. So if you did a survey in the future, and you ask the same questions, you could see which way that needle goes. So that may be one way to tell. But I think the survey's already been developed, and I'm not sure what kind of questions are in there, but that may be one baseline we could look at as well going
That's
forward.
what I'm asking for, is just recommendations about how we measure our work so that we can start building that library of evidence to support this type of work around the country.
Absolutely. And I'll stay after for your questions, because I had some for your background questions that I can answer. So I'll stay until you guys are done.
A tentative timeline sent officially as opposed to the various notes that we've taken?
We will, but there's some things that are just such in play. I don't want one document out there where I know it's just not correct. You will get it. You'll get it before the next commission meeting. But again, there's just some things we need to work on a little bit. Okay? Anything else? Thank you so much for what I thought was it was an excellent meeting. And I want to apologize to you, but I also want to share this, because I know there are all kinds of nasty things going on out there. My cough is not contagious. Unfortunately, I suffer from acid reflux, and I'm going through a really bad time right now. But I'm not contagious. Just really disruptive. Thank you. Have a great evening, and thanks to the committees for meeting. Make sure you have fewer than 8.